From the KSL Broadcast House, this is Sunday Edition with Doug Wright.
And a good morning to you. Welcome to Sunday Edition. We're counting down the days to the midterm elections, now just over a week away. A new NBC poll is finding higher interest among voters, Republicans slightly more than Democrats, saying that they're very engaged with this election. NBC News senior political director Mark Murray breaks down the numbers.
We are seeing sky-high enthusiasm and election interest in the upcoming midterm elections, with 70% of all voters expressing high interest in the upcoming midterms. That's higher than the 65% who said this 4 years ago before the 2018 midterms, which set a modern-day record for midterm turnout. When it comes to, though, which party actually has the enthusiasm advantage, it's Republicans in our poll. You end up having 78% of Republicans indicating high interest in the upcoming midterms versus 69% for Democrats. Democrats had been catching up with Republicans on this enthusiasm gap, but Republicans were able to expand their advantages from our previous surveys. The number one issue, according to voters in our poll, was threats to democracy. That was for the third straight NBC News poll where that ranked as number one. Behind that comes jobs and the economy, and then the cost of living. Of course, when you add up both the cost of living and the economy, that ends up overpassing and surpassing the threats to democracy. But what is maybe motivating voters more than anything else is just pure anger. Our poll finds that some 80% of Democrats and 80% of Republicans believing that the opposition party and its agenda, if enacted, would end up posing a threat to the United States and to the democracy. And so that anger from both Democrats and Republicans seems to be the one thing that both sides end up agreeing on in our poll.
Very interesting. And here in the state of Utah, all eyes are on the Senate race between incumbent Republican Mike Lee and his opponent, independent challenger Evan McMullin. A close contest, according to the most recent polling that we have seen, Lee with a 4 to 5 point edge. We asked NBC News' Steve Kornacki to break down how this race could throw a wrench in the balance of power in the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the Utah race is the single biggest wild card on the Senate battleground map. Let's call the battleground map up here. You notice Utah is not shaded in, but let's look at it this way. What you see in blue are the 5 Democratic-held seats right now for the Senate that are the most vulnerable. These are the seats Democrats are most vulnerable to lose to Republicans. In red, you see the 5 Republican seats that the Republicans are most vulnerable to lose to the Democrats. Now, right now, of course, the Senate is 50-50, and the tie is broken by the Vice President Kamala Harris in favor of the Democrats. So for Republicans, the name of the game is to gain a seat. So there's a scenario here. I mean, there's a whole bunch of scenarios, but I'll give you a very simple one. There's a very simple scenario where Republicans win the Senate race in Nevada. They actually do lead in the polling there. It's close, but they lead in the polling in Nevada. Adam Laxalt, the Republican, leading Catherine Cortez Masto, the Democrat. If Republicans were to do that and everything else on this map stayed the same, then Republicans would be up 51-49. But then, that should be a 9, 51-49. But then, when I say Utah's the wild card, let's say there was a surprise in Utah on election night and Evan McMullin unseated Mike Lee. Then suddenly, instead of 51-49, it'd be back to 50-49. And at that point, yeah, McMullin says he's not going to caucus with either party, but he would have the potential in this kind of scenario, if he chose to caucus with Democrats just to organize the Senate, he would then give them their 50th vote, and Kamala Harris would be able to break the tie again, and Democrats could get control. There's a world where McMullin gets the upset win in Utah, and at least on paper, at least potentially, his vote could deliver Senate control to the Democrats or Senate control to the Republicans. So I know he says he won't caucus with anybody, but if we ever end up in a situation like that, he would be under enormous, enormous pressure. It'd be very interesting to see what he does.
It is amazing right now, the focus on Utah nationally, but I want to get to another one of the big issues that happens to be on our ballot here in the state of Utah, and that's Constitutional Amendment A. It would give the Utah legislature more leeway on the amount of money it can spend during an emergency, like COVID. Right now, lawmakers can spend 1% of the state budget during the special session. The amendment would adjust that to 5%. We've invited State Representative Jeff Stenquist to walk us through what this is all about. Now, this is catching a lot of people off guard. I have to admit, I was caught a little off guard. I went, okay, and then I'm going through the judges, and then I went, Amendment A. I've got some studying to do. Walk us through this. How did it come about, and what does it do?
Well, really, it is what we talked about, where the legislature in an emergency such as COVID, that we would have more flexibility to respond to that emergency. And that's something that we realized when we were going through that. And so it's something that's kind of down in the weeds a little bit with our budget process, but I think it is something that's important for us to have that flexibility to be able to do.
It sounds like, changing the Constitution of anything, I always deem to be a pretty important thing.
Absolutely.
Are we kind of flying into this a little blind as far as public knowledge is concerned? Because I've read several columns in various papers and so on, and even some observers of politics, I like to fancy myself to be in that category, I was caught a bit off guard by this.
Yeah, I think it's something with so many other things happening in politics that it's something that maybe hasn't had a lot of attention paid to it. But I think we've learned that this is something that we would like to be able to have. One of the things that I've heard is that I've heard concerns from constituents that would say, well, does this mean that you're just going to be able to go and spend more money? And that's not really the case. In the state of Utah, we can only spend within our means. And so it really, though, I think a better way to think of it is allows us to move money around in the case of an emergency where we had to hold a special session, that we could move funding away from less essential services and reallocate those towards some essential services in those particular circumstances.
Representative, something that I've heard from conversations, and I've also read in articles, and I've honestly wondered about this. Shouldn't the governor be involved in this, the balance of power and the whole thing? Or is this something where, and because that's a lot of flexibility. You go from 1% to 5%, and instead of talking about, what is it, 2.6 billion, you're talking about a whole lot more. Shouldn't the gov be involved in that?
Well, certainly we do have constitutional checks and balances between the governor and the legislature. The governor, signs any legislation that we pass as a legislature. But constitutionally, the legislature does have the power of the purse. We're the ones that allocate the funding and decide where that money needs to go. The executive branch is extremely important in an emergency situation because they're the ones, it's the executive branch that can react quickly to those things. But when it comes to funding, that's the legislature's responsibility.
Usually, though, that happens with a process.
Yes.
The governor, even though you do hold the purse strings, and that's absolutely right, locally and nationally, but the governor comes up with a budget, too, that he recommends, and it seems to be a real co-effort and a little pull and tug here and there to make sure that the budget is serving Utah in the best way. But again, in an emergency, with the flexibility of the governor and the relationship between the two branches, should not the governor be involved?
Well, I think certainly there is a lot of collaboration. We work very well between the legislature and the governor. And I think especially as we saw in COVID, we were working very closely with the governor, but when we needed as a legislature to move things around in our budget, we found that there were some limitations that, especially when we had a lot of federal funds that were being allocated towards us, that we needed a little bit more flexibility in that.
I think one of the reasons, Representative, and I'm sure you're very aware of this, I think that people are a little bit, not necessarily concerned, but a little bit paying particular attention to this because of the other things that have enabled the legislature to call itself into special session without the governor's approval, or in the past, the governor would call the special session. Is there concern about what appears to be the trajectory of this?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that there's, I'm not personally concerned because the legislature really has the responsibility for setting policy and for funding. These are big responsibilities, which is why we have not just one person, but 104 legislators elected from across the state. And we have processes that allow us to make sure that when we're passing legislation and when we're allocating funds, that we get a lot of input to make sure that we're coming up with the best policy and allocating according to our priorities. And we do have a very good working relationship with the governor, and we work in lockstep to make sure that we're addressing the needs for all Utahns.
Representative, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to join us to talk about Amendment A. We appreciate you being here.
Absolutely.
And when we come back, we'll be talking with Chase Thomas with Alliance for a Better Utah about why they're pushing back against the very amendment that we've been discussing. Stay with us. We've been talking about the Utah ballots and, of course, the election, which is just about a week away. Some Utah voters may be a little surprised to find a constitutional amendment. I've already admitted that it caught me a little bit off guard. It would give more spending power to our Utah State Legislature in an emergency. But not everybody's on board, and we've invited Chase Thomas, who is Executive Director of Alliance for a Better Utah, to come on the show and talk about the opposition. First of all, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. And why is your alliance concerned about Amendment A?
Well, thank you so much for having me. We're opposed to Constitutional Amendment A because we believe it's an unnecessary power grab by the legislature at the expense of our constitutional checks and balances. We think it's really important to continue having checks and balances where different parts of the government have to work together rather than giving all the power in one part of the government, in the legislature in this case.
The first concern that I have had about this, regardless of how somebody is going to vote ultimately, is that it is catching so many people off guard. Are you hearing that generally? I've heard it from some fairly in-tune individuals who normally are kind of on top of everything.
Yeah, it seems like it's a really political insider type of amendment, and so it's nobody's been talking about it until they get their ballots and they're like, what is this thing at the end of it and how should I vote? We've been hearing that a lot.
The actual amount, 1% is what the legislature has now as basically wiggle room.
Yes.
Where they can adjust things within the budget without a big brouhaha. But this is jumping not from 2 or 3 or 4, but it's jumping to 5%. That is not insignificant, especially when you talk about the billions and billions of dollars that we have in Utah's budget.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. Right now, the legislature, during an emergency special session, they spend about $250 million. This goes all the way up to $1.3 billion based on our current budget. And it also allows them to slash the budget as much as they want and accept as much federal funds as they want as well. So it's a huge amount of money.
As you have looked at this as the Alliance, I haven't heard feedback from some people that normally we would hear feedback from, like a governor or somebody like that. Are there things out there afoot? Are there concerns at the highest level of government on this? Or is this more just a grassroots concern for you and your organization?
I think it's more of a grassroots thing. Like, we really haven't been hearing a lot of people speaking up in favor of it or against it. And I think it's because of what you were talking about, how it caught a lot of people by surprise. It seemed like it was just lawmakers and the political insiders who knew that this was coming up, but most people just caught them by surprise.
I haven't seen any polling on this. We've been in the state of Utah doing a lot of polling because of a very prominent race we have that has national interest. Has anybody asked a little sub-question, hey, by the way, what about Amendment A?
Not that I've seen. It's going to be a surprise to us to see how this goes.
Yeah. Are you getting any gut feel, the reaction that you're getting, and when you talk with rank and file folks?
Normally when I hear from ordinary people, if they see a question on the ballot that they don't know about, they vote against it instinctively, especially when it's something that's confusing and a constitutional amendment. So that's the gut feeling that I've been getting as I've been talking to people, is that if they don't know anything about it, they voted against, and then they hear about our position later and they say, oh, well, I'm glad I voted that way. So I've been hearing a lot in that direction, but it remains to be seen.
In many elections, we have a really nice voter information pamphlet that gives a yay or a nay, arguments for and against. Did I miss that somewhere?
Nobody submitted anything. We didn't submit anything either because we didn't know what the deadline was for the voter information pamphlet. We hadn't done that before. But it's just a blank page that says no arguments were submitted in favor or against.
Yeah. What would you recommend? Obviously, our previous guest was for it, Utah State Legislator. He addressed some of my concerns. You obviously and your organization are against it. What is the best kind of neutral way we could actually find out about since there is not the traditional argument in the voter pamphlet?
Well, I mean, the most neutral way you could do is go and listen to the legislative hearings where they debated this. There were lawmakers who voted against it during the legislative session. On our website, betterutah.institute.org, we also put together an impartial background and analysis of what this would do without how it goes either way. We eventually took a position against it, but we tried to provide an impartial just look at what it would do and how it would impact our state.
Well, we certainly appreciate you joining us. It was interesting to hear both sides on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much
for joining us on Sunday Edition. And we'll be right back after the break with the latest data from the Dignity Index, what it reveals about our candidates for office right here in the state of Utah. Welcome back to the program. For the last several weeks on Sunday Edition, we've invited experts from the Dignity Index to share their scores on the messages being used in each campaign. This week, they are focused on social media posts by both candidates in the Senate race in our state. Now, a reminder, the index scores are the words candidates are using and not, of course, the candidates themselves. And here to talk about the most recent scores, we have Tammy Pfeiffer and Kara Byrne from the Kemsey Gardner Policy Institute. And thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. Let's actually start with a Facebook post that Senator Mike Lee has out there. Back on October 19th, he says, quote, "Unfortunately, over the last 2 years, Congress has been totally controlled by Democrats that have rubber-stamped Joe Biden's radical agenda. The best way to turn that around is to ensure we vote in a Republican majority next month." Now let's talk about one from Evan McMullin, then we'll get your analysis on the score. This came from Evan McMullin on October 17th, and he wrote on Twitter, "Utah, I hope tonight left you feeling hopeful. Hopeful that we can protect our democracy. Hopeful that we can heal our nation's broken politics. Our cross-partisan coalition is an example of how we move forward from the extremism and division. Thank you for being on my team." Let's talk about that before we go deeper, or people start losing their place here. So what are your thoughts on those two posts that we heard? And I don't know who would like to go first. Maybe that,
yeah, I'm
sure.
happy to go. Sure. You know, you said before we go deeper, I did want to point out they're both examples of the array of posts that we scored. So you just so happened to pull one from Mike Lee that was on the contemptuous side, but both candidates were scored contemptuous and dignified on the post that we selected for this week. And so I think, you know, what you did pull though, so on the Mike Lee post, that one, you know, scored a little bit more on the contemptuous side. It was more of an us versus them, whereas the McMullin was one of the examples of something more on the dignified side. And that one was scored as a 6, where you're hearing more of an obligation to work together. You know, this is my duty, this is my obligation. And I think it's interesting that we heard 6s from both candidates this week, or saw 6s from both candidates this week on social media posts.
Do you have a quick response to that?
Yeah, I do. A lot of times we are talking about the Dignity Index, illuminating this language that we use, and it's a problem-solving tool. So think of these two posts as people that we want to help solve problems for the country. And when you say we don't trust the other side, that's not a real good problem-solving strategy. But when you say, I can work across divides, a bipartisan coalition, that's problem-solving language. That's why one is on the contempt side and one is on the dignity side.
We're going to share two, and unfortunately we don't have more time to really delve into this at great depth, but let's look at an Instagram post from Senator Lee just 3 days ago. He says, "It's time for a government that respects you. A Republican majority in Congress is the only way we can get our country back on track." Here's a tweet from Evan McMullin from back on September 30th. "My opponent's campaign is being bankrolled by special interest groups, PACs, and party bosses, but mine isn't. I made a promise to Utahns that I wouldn't take a dime from these dark money groups." Now, let's just very quickly, and I've only left you with just a second, just give us a quick take, Tammy.
So on the first one, when you say it's time for a government that respects you, you're saying the government looks down on you. And so you should probably look down on the government. I mean, it's just full of contempt and trying to pit one party against the other and show that we can't get along. And you shouldn't trust them because they look down on you.
Kara, just a very quick response.
You know, I always reflect back on the Dignity Index and look at the language, which anybody can look up on Dignity on our website, thedignityndex.us. So.
I so appreciate you both joining us today. I wish we had more time because this has been fascinating to look at some of the advertisements that we're seeing out there. And I think we have a little bit more time than I had anticipated. Let's go to a Twitter post this came from Senator Lee on October 21st. My opponent is running to keep Kamala Harris in charge of a divided U.S. Senate. Democrats endorsed McMullen's candidacy. Democrat consultants run his campaign. Democrat bundlers fund his campaign. His message is full of Democratic attack lines. What about that? Let's
Sure, yeah. I mean, this is a classic us versus them. And so, you know, this one, our trained group of diverse coders came to consensus and coded this of 4. Again, I always encourage people to look at the index themselves and determine. But yeah, like I said, classic us versus them. He is them, and they are bad.
Yeah. Tammy, your thoughts?
Yeah, you're not one of us.
Yes.
And that's so divisive. You are not one of us.
Let's do this one now. This finally will come from Evan McMullen on Twitter. This is from October 17th. Mike Lee is the only member of Utah's congressional delegation that isn't blacklisted by Russia. Why? He's Putin's most reliable yes man in the U.S. Senate. Your thoughts on that one? And Tammy, let's talk with you first.
So this is one step down from you're not one of us. When you start ascribing some, moral value, you're just a puppet. Not only you're not one of us, but you're a puppet. You just do things because other people tell you to do it. And that takes that down from the 4 to a 3.
And your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, we heard this a lot this week, or saw this a lot this week, where, they're not capable of making their own decisions. So this political puppet theme kind of came through a few times this week.
This has been a very interesting insight to be able to look at the Dignity Index and see the score of it. And again, how can people get this information and see it?
So go to dignityndex.us, and it will pull up all of these scores, the descriptions, and the real eye-opener, as we've talked before, is that you apply it to yourself.
And thank you both for joining us, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Sunday Edition. We hope you'll join us again next week. Music and the spoken word, that's coming up next.